It was a busy evening, the kind where every table felt alive with chatter and the clatter of dishes. The coffee machine hissed, the fryer popped, and the regular rhythm of the diner made it easy to forget anyone else was there. But then a sound cut through it, soft but sharp, a quiet cry for help. A waitress stumbled behind the counter, wincing as she lifted a tray. Her ankle twisted slightly, and her hand shook as she tried to steady herself. Nobody noticed at first, or if they did, they looked away, focused on their own meals. But something about the way she moved, the hesitation in her step, made it impossible to ignore. She muttered under her breath, almost too quiet to hear, "I can't keep up like this." Her voice trembled, not from weakness but from the weight of trying to stay upright, to keep going, to not let anyone see how much she was hurting. Then the door opened, and the air shifted. Someone entered who didn't rush, didn't shout, didn't announce themselves. He walked in slowly, scanning the room with calm eyes. The kind of eyes that notice details others overlook, the kind that see someone struggling before they even speak. He didn't step forward immediately, didn't push into the moment. He just stood there, taking it in, letting the scene speak to him. The soft cry, the tray trembling, the way she tried to hide it behind a fake smile. It all registered without judgment, without panic, just a quiet awareness that something was wrong. People around him didn't notice the change at first. The hum of the diner continued, the conversations and clinking plates carrying on like nothing had shifted. But he did. He saw her, and in that instant, the small, unnoticed cry became impossible to ignore. She glanced up, catching his eyes for just a moment, and something shifted. Not fear, not relief exactly, but recognition that someone finally saw her struggle. The kind of recognition that didn't demand explanation, didn't question her pain, just acknowledged it existed. He took a careful step closer, not rushing, not imposing, just present. And in that simple presence, the tension that had been building around her, every slip, every wincing movement, every forced smile, felt a little lighter. The quiet cry had found someone who noticed, someone who mattered, and the world, for the first time in that hectic diner, seemed to pause just long enough for her to be seen. The waitress tried to keep moving, balancing trays as if nothing was wrong, but her steps faltered just enough to catch someone's attention. One of the managers looked over, his brow furrowed, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "You okay there?" he asked, his voice carrying that mix of irritation and uncertainty that makes you second-guess yourself. She forced a smile, shaking her head lightly, trying to show she was fine, even though every movement told a different story. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for a plate. She straightened her back, took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but the effort was visible. The manager's eyes lingered a moment too long, as if measuring whether she was pretending or hiding something serious. From across the diner, Stephen moved closer, but he didn't speak yet. He crouched slightly, careful to meet her gaze without crowding her, just letting her know he noticed. He didn't ask for permission, didn't demand explanation. He simply acknowledged her struggle with a calm nod, a gesture that said, "I see you, I understand, you're not alone." The waitress paused, her shoulders dropping slightly at the recognition. She hadn't needed words, just that simple act of noticing. It made a difference, even if just a small one. How do you usually react when you see someone struggling, but unsure how to help? Her fingers brushed against the tray nervously, and Stephen stayed still, waiting, patient, giving her space while still being present. There was no rush, no dramatic intervention, just steady attention, letting her feel that she didn't have to hide anymore. Every second counted. Every small movement mattered. The tremble in her hands, the shift of weight from one foot to the other, the faint wince, he saw it all. And in that silent acknowledgement, the room felt just a little quieter, a little more attentive, as if the unnoticed struggle had finally been given a place to exist. Minutes passed, and the tension in the diner started to rise. A spilled drink caught someone's eye. A tray wobbled just slightly, and suddenly the small struggle of the waitress began to look like carelessness. Whispers rippled through the nearby tables, customers leaning in, watching, waiting for what would happen next. The manager frowned deeper, his assumptions growing with every hesitation she showed. What had been a quiet, personal struggle now began to feel like a mistake in everyone else's eyes. Every small motion she made was interpreted, analyzed, as if the effort itself was suspicious. Stephen stayed close, but didn't intervene aggressively. He didn't call anyone out. He simply watched, observing the strain in her shoulders, the slight tremor in her hands, the way she shifted her weight from one foot to the other. Each detail told him the story he already knew. This wasn't carelessness, it was exhaustion, it was pain, it was someone trying to keep going when they couldn't. The air around them thickened with expectation. Patrons whispered, some frowning, some pulling out their phones, but he remained calm, present, a steady force in the midst of misunderstanding. He leaned just slightly, enough to let her feel he was there, without stepping into her space, without adding to the pressure. Every second felt heavier. Every glance, every interpretation added weight to a moment that had already become too much. And through it all, he stayed quiet, letting the truth of her struggle exist without needing to argue, letting the scene unfold while still shielding her from judgment with the simple power of observation. The diner's energy shifted slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. Patrons were mid-conversation when a few heads turned, noticing the waitress struggling to balance plates. One cup teetered on the edge of a tray, and for a heartbeat, time seemed to stretch. Whispers began to ripple through the room. People leaned in slightly, curious. Some pulled out their phones, not to record out of malice, but because something about the scene felt compelling, unusual. The tension that had been contained behind the counter now spilled outward into the room. The waitress froze for a moment, aware of the attention but not sure how to respond. Her face flushed, a mix of embarrassment and relief washing over her. Relief, because at last someone had noticed. Embarrassment, because now everyone was noticing. She had tried so hard to keep it quiet, to manage her pain silently, and suddenly the entire diner was watching. Stephen stayed close, moving just enough to offer support without overtly interfering. His presence was calm, deliberate, a silent anchor in the middle of the growing scrutiny. He gestured gently toward a nearby chair, not commanding, just guiding, and the waitress slowly lowered herself, her hands shaking slightly as she settled in. She let herself be seen for the first time in hours, the strain in her shoulders easing fractionally. Every small movement, the way she pressed her hands against her knees, the slight slump of her back, the careful avoidance of eye contact, was noticed, absorbed, and acknowledged by someone who truly saw her. Patrons murmured quietly, some frowning, some still peeking from behind menus, but the whispering carried no judgment yet. The subtle shift in attention created a new atmosphere, one where the waitress's struggle was no longer hidden, no longer invisible. Do you think showing vulnerability in public is harder than facing the problem alone? Stephen crouched slightly, close enough for her to feel supported without feeling crowded. He let her take the moment she needed, giving her permission, silently, to exist in the space without having to prove anything. The subtle power of being noticed without being judged created a shift in the room's energy. The manager, standing nearby, caught the change too. His frown softened slightly, his assumptions challenged not by words but by the calm, deliberate acknowledgement of someone who understood. He stepped back just enough to let the moment breathe, letting her regain a fragment of control. Every second stretched long enough for her to feel the difference between being overlooked and being seen. Patrons began to glance around at each other, noticing how attention could shift without drama, how someone could stand quietly but powerfully beside another person in need. The waitress, still sitting, felt a subtle but important change in herself. The embarrassment remained, yes, but it was tempered by relief. She had been exposed to the public eye, yet not attacked. She had been noticed, validated, and the simple act of that recognition allowed her a small measure of strength to return, one measured breath at a time. Her eyes flicked briefly to Stephen, gratitude unspoken but evident. He remained patient, letting her gather herself, letting her understand that being seen didn't have to mean being judged. The diner hummed around them, but in that corner, a quiet recalibration had taken place. She sank lower into the chair, her back curved, shoulders heavy, like the weight of the day had finally landed fully on her. Every movement felt slow, deliberate, almost as if gravity itself had become sharper. The tray she had been carrying earlier now sat forgotten on the counter, a silent reminder of how fragile things had felt just moments before. Her hands rested in her lap, trembling slightly, and she barely noticed the small cuts on her knuckles from gripping the edges of trays and counters earlier. The strain of holding up, pretending, and pushing through it finally caught up. She closed her eyes for a moment, just long enough to feel the exhaustion in her chest, the ache in her legs, and the burn behind her eyes. Around her, the diner continued its rhythm, plates clinking, coffee machines hissing, conversations murmuring, but none of it reached her. She felt invisible and exposed at the same time, as if the world could see her weakness, but no one could reach in to help. She wanted to disappear, to retreat somewhere quiet, but there was no place to hide. Do you think showing vulnerability in public is harder than facing the problem alone? Her breathing was uneven, shallow, each inhale carrying the weight of frustration, each exhale trembling with helplessness. She pressed her palms against her knees, hoping that small act would ground her, but the floor beneath her felt both too solid and too indifferent. Stephen crouched nearby, silent but attentive, letting her feel the presence of someone who understood without intruding. He didn't speak, didn't rush, didn't offer advice. He simply existed beside her, a steadying point, letting her process the ache and humiliation in her own time. The low hum of the diner seemed louder in contrast to her silence, a reminder of how alone she felt even amid people. Every whispered conversation, every glance from a passing patron, felt magnified, as if the judgment she feared had crystallized around her. She buried her face briefly in her hands, feeling the heat of embarrassment and the sting of fatigue. It wasn't just physical pain. Her pride, her sense of capability, all felt bruised. She had tried to manage everything, to maintain composure, but now the facade was gone, leaving her raw and exposed. Her eyes flicked to the floor, then to the small stack of plates she had nearly dropped, the ones that had wobbled and threatened to spill. Each object became a marker of her vulnerability, each movement a reminder that she had been seen struggling. She clenched her fists lightly, not to fight anyone, but to reclaim a fraction of control, a sense of grounding amid the chaos. Even in this low point, the awareness that someone else, Stephen, noticed without judgment offered a fragile thread of comfort. She could feel it, faint and tentative, weaving through the heaviness, a reminder that even at her weakest, she was not entirely alone. Her shoulders shook once, a small quiver of suppressed emotion, and she let herself feel it fully, letting the tension in her body settle just enough to acknowledge the depth of the day's struggle. Her hands curled around the edge of the chair as she drew in a shaky breath, and for the first time since the incident began, a spark of determination flickered. The fatigue and embarrassment were still there, heavy in her limbs, but somewhere under it, a quiet resolve began to form. Stephen straightened slightly beside her, his presence firm but unobtrusive, as if he was giving her space while silently reminding her she wasn't powerless. He didn't need to speak. The way he simply stood there, calm and focused, reminded her that control could shift without shouting, without confrontation. She slowly lifted her gaze, meeting the eyes of those who had been watching moments before. The whispers and sidelong glances were still there, but now she noticed them differently. They were no longer a judgment she had to internalize. They were details to navigate, not chains to hold her down. Her posture straightened, shoulders rolling back, breath deepening, as if signaling to herself that she could reclaim the narrative. The manager, noticing the change, hesitated. The hesitation was subtle, a slight pause in his stance, but it was enough for her to sense that the tide was shifting. She had been at the mercy of assumptions, pushed into a corner of scrutiny and doubt, but now, with measured movements, she began to take back the space that had been lost. She rose from the chair, each step deliberate, controlled. The tray she had almost dropped earlier was returned to the counter with careful precision, not in fear, but in ownership of the moment. The room seemed to adjust around her. Patrons paused mid-action, sensing a shift in authority, a subtle command of attention that didn't require aggression. Stephen nodded once, faint but meaningful, acknowledging her reclaiming of strength. She didn't need his words, but the quiet support allowed her to act decisively, to move as someone who had been underestimated and yet remained fully capable. The manager attempted to speak, his voice uncertain now, lacking the earlier sharpness. She met him calmly, conveying through a glance that she was no longer the one caught off guard. The previous imbalance, the weight of doubt and misinterpretation, had shifted. She was steady, intentional, and observant, and those who had assumed authority before now found themselves pausing, reconsidering. Every movement reinforced it. A calm hand motion here, a precise step there, a glance that commanded attention without shouting. It all combined into a subtle but unmistakable reversal of power. She had been seen as fragile, struggling, vulnerable, and now she stood as deliberate, grounded, and fully present. The air around her changed. The quiet murmurs of patrons softened, some lowering their phones, others exchanging glances. The tension that had surrounded her began to dissipate as she moved through it, not recklessly, not vindicatively, but with the clear assertion that she was capable, that she was no longer at the mercy of assumptions or second guesses. Even her breathing carried the shift. What had been shallow, anxious breaths became measured and calm. The tremor in her hands subsided into steady control. Each small action communicated that she had regained authority over herself, her environment, and the way others perceived her. Stephen remained beside her, a silent anchor, allowing her to take the lead while providing unwavering support. The dynamic that had been weighted against her now balanced, not through confrontation, but through the simple act of standing firm and moving with intention. The subtle reversal didn't happen all at once. It built with each deliberate choice, each small reclamation of space and composure. By the time she fully stood, there was no question in the room. She had shifted the balance, quietly but unmistakably, proving that presence, calmness, and clarity could reclaim power even in the most intense, scrutinized moments. She finally sank back into the chair, letting her shoulders slump, feeling the tension in her body unwind just slightly. The adrenaline that had carried her through the struggle began to ebb, leaving behind a raw ache she couldn't ignore. Her hands rested on her knees, fingers lightly trembling, but for the first time in hours, she allowed herself to notice it without immediately trying to mask it. Stephen stayed close, a quiet presence beside her. He didn't speak, didn't gesture, didn't draw attention to himself. He simply existed in the space, steady and calm, letting her process what had happened at her own pace. Each slow breath she took seemed to match the unspoken rhythm he offered, a reminder that she was not alone even in silence. Her mind replayed the moments before, the small judgments, the whispered assumptions, the pressure of eyes watching. It all felt heavier now, magnified by the quiet aftermath. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the sensations wash over her, from the sting in her palms to the ache in her legs. And in that quiet, she began to feel the depth of what it meant to have someone simply be there. How important do you think it is to have someone quietly support you instead of making a show of it? She allowed herself to acknowledge the mix of emotions, frustration, exhaustion, embarrassment, and relief all tangled together. The weight of the day pressed down, but not in a way that forced her to move. It was a heavy pause, a moment to feel fully human, fully vulnerable, without the need to explain or justify. Stephen's presence was gentle but deliberate, an anchor in the current of emotions she couldn't yet name. He didn't speak words of reassurance. He didn't offer advice. He simply remained, giving her permission to feel everything she was feeling without judgment, without urgency, without performance. Her eyes traced the outlines of the diner, the edges of tables, the faces of people quietly noticing but not interfering. It all seemed distant, almost like a blur, while the space immediately around her felt grounded, secure, and hers to process in her own time. She let out a slow breath, feeling tension ease from her chest and shoulders. For the first time since the incident began, she allowed herself a small moment of recognition. She had endured, she had navigated judgment and exposure, and she was still here, still processing, still breathing. The quiet presence beside her magnified that realization, not by speaking, but simply by existing in solidarity. Her hands rested lightly on her lap, fingers flexing again as if testing that control had returned. She realized that strength wasn't just in what she had done outwardly. It was in letting herself be human, letting the raw feelings come, and having someone witness that quietly without turning it into a spectacle. The subtle weight of validation came not through words or gestures, but through consistency, through calm attention. Each heartbeat felt less burdened. Each inhale felt a little longer, a little steadier. And in that space, she began to reclaim not just composure, but the quiet confidence that comes from being fully seen and supported. As she sat there, letting the quiet settle around her, the weight of everything that had happened began to shift into perspective. The humiliation, the struggle, the moments where she had felt powerless, they weren't erased, but they started to take on a different texture. They became reminders, markers of what she could endure and still move forward from. Each small act, each moment of tension, now carried meaning beyond just what had happened in that space. The spilled trays, the whispered assumptions, the trembling hands, they weren't just incidents. They were evidence of resilience, of being tested and finding the strength to stand through all. Her gaze lingered on the diner around her, the steady rhythm of plates and cups, the quiet hum of conversation. It all felt larger now, the world both intimidating and alive, and she understood that the moments of challenge held lessons in clarity, patience, and self-respect. Strength wasn't always in the big gestures. It was in holding yourself together, even when no one seemed to notice or understand. The subtle presence beside her reminded her that meaning often comes through shared experience, through someone witnessing without overtly fixing anything, simply holding space for what was real. That quiet acknowledgement gave depth to her ordeal, transforming frustration and fear into a kind of clarity that she could carry with her beyond that moment. Every breath she took became a small assertion, a quiet declaration that she could process, reflect, and move forward without needing external validation. The pain, the embarrassment, even the exhaustion, they became part of a layer of understanding she could use to measure herself, to know what she was capable of enduring, and to see the value in standing tall when it mattered most. The day's chaos settled into a memory that was no longer sharp and frantic, but layered with insight. Each sensation, each fleeting thought, now held a lesson in perspective, a quiet reminder that surviving and reclaiming your center in the midst of turmoil was meaningful in itself. She leaned back slightly, letting her hands rest loosely in her lap, eyes following the quiet movement of people around her. The tension that had gripped her all day began to ebb, replaced by a subtle calm that felt almost unfamiliar but welcome. She realized how much of the weight she'd carried wasn't just physical. It had been the pressure of being seen, judged, and misunderstood. Stephen stayed beside her, silent, letting her settle without interrupting or rushing the moment. The calm in his presence made it possible to breathe, to notice small details, the soft clatter of dishes, the distant hum of conversation, the gentle rhythm of her own heartbeat. In that quiet, she felt the layers of the day settle, each one a reminder of endurance, presence, and quiet strength. Her mind wandered to the small victories she had claimed along the way, holding her ground, maintaining control, and letting herself feel everything without shame. She realized strength wasn't always loud or visible. It was often soft, steady, and patient. Each breath she drew was a quiet acknowledgement of what she had faced, what she had survived, and the calm that could follow even after chaos. She exhaled slowly, letting the relief wash over her without words, without explanation. There was no fanfare, no applause, just the gentle understanding that she had navigated it all and that she was still whole. The subtle peace that settled over her was quiet but profound, a soft reflection on resilience, care, and the strength found in simply standing through it.